Stay in your seat. 22C. You're just a civilian, a flight attendant snapped as the woman stood up during the chaotic flight. Every eye turned toward her with contempt and dismissal. She quietly sat back down without arguing. But hours later, the aircraft shook violently, navigation systems failing completely. The captain announced desperately, "We've lost navigation." The Air Force One escort squadron simultaneously saluted a call sign over the radio. Her call sign. Emily Rhodes was 31 years old, with long brown hair, a tall, lean frame, wearing simple jeans and a casual jacket as she sat in seat 22C in economy class. She quietly read from a small notebook, actually an old flight manual from her military days. The passenger beside her sneered, "Dreaming of being a pilot?" Flight attendants showed visible irritation, treating her as a troublesome passenger who didn't belong in their orderly cabin. When the aircraft experienced mild turbulence, Emily stood up to check around the cabin. The flight attendant immediately snapped, "Stay in your seat, 22C. You're just a civilian." The entire cabin erupted in laughter, looking down on her with obvious contempt. Emily silently returned to her seat, clutching her notebook, eyes gazing out the window without arguing back. A passenger later recalled, "In that moment, she didn't blush or argue back, just remained silent. Looking into her eyes, I had the feeling she'd been hearing insults like this her whole life." What none of them knew was Emily's extraordinary background, hidden beneath her deliberately ordinary appearance. 7 years earlier, she had been Captain Emily Rhodes, callsign Raven 6, commanding officer of an elite F-16 squadron tasked with protecting Air Force One during high-risk diplomatic missions. Her tactical flying skills had been legendary among military aviators. She could navigate by instruments alone in conditions that grounded other pilots, and her squadron had never lost a protectee during her command. But during one critical mission, an unexpected enemy surface-to-air missile had struck her wingman's aircraft. While she had successfully completed the protection mission, saving the lives of everyone aboard Air Force One, she had been unable to save Lieutenant Sarah Chen, her closest friend and flying partner. The guilt had consumed her completely. Despite receiving commendations for the successful mission, Emily blamed herself for Chen's death and requested immediate discharge from active duty. She had deliberately chosen the most anonymous civilian life possible, taking jobs that kept her far from aviation and the military community that had once been her entire world. Flying as a passenger in economy class was part of that anonymity. She traveled this way to visit her aging mother, enduring the casual dismissal of people who saw her simple clothes and economy seat as evidence of her insignificance. The notebook she carried contained technical aviation information she had memorized years ago, but reviewing it was both painful and comforting, a connection to skills she had tried to forget but couldn't entirely abandon. Emily had perfected the art of being invisible, blending into crowds of people who would never suspect they were sharing space with someone who had once commanded the skies around the most important aircraft in the world. She chose to absorb their contempt because she believed she deserved it for failing to save her wingman. But some skills never disappear, even when someone desperately wants to forget them. Tonight, those skills would be needed again in the most unexpected way. Hours into the flight, the aircraft began shaking violently, far beyond normal turbulence. Screams filled the cabin as passengers gripped their armrests, many crying and praying as the plane pitched unpredictably. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom with barely controlled panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've lost navigation. Communications are down." Panic erupted throughout the cabin. The businessman who had mocked Emily earlier screamed, "We're doomed!" An elderly passenger whispered trembling prayers. Someone has to do something. Flight attendants rushed through the aisles, trying to calm passengers while clearly panicked themselves. Their professional training hadn't prepared them for a complete navigation failure at cruising altitude. Emily sat perfectly still, her trained ears analyzing every sound the aircraft made, automatically assessing the mechanical situation from vibrations and engine noise patterns. She recognized the symptoms. The aircraft had lost GPS navigation, radio communications, and backup navigation systems simultaneously. Without ground reference points or radio guidance, the pilots were flying blind in increasingly dangerous airspace. The same people who had laughed at her hours earlier were now sobbing with terror. But Emily's mind was calculating flight vectors, fuel consumption rates, and emergency procedures. Finally, she stood up. This time, no flight attendant dared challenge her. Her voice was calm and authoritative. "Let me into the cockpit. Patch me to Eagle Control. Use call sign Raven 6. The entire cabin fell silent. Every eye focused on her with complete attention. A flight attendant later recalled, "Her voice wasn't a request. It was a command. We followed it like a reflex." Emily walked to the cockpit with the confidence of someone who had been in similar situations before. The flight crew, desperate for any assistance, immediately granted her access. She slid into the observer seat behind the pilots and activated the emergency radio frequency. "Eagle Control, this is Raven 6 requesting immediate link." The response was instantaneous. "Raven 6, welcome back. Air Force One acknowledges." The captain and co-pilot stared at her in disbelief as she began coordinating with air traffic control using terminology and procedures they had never heard in civilian aviation. Emily's hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced expertise, identifying backup systems the crew hadn't known existed and implementing emergency navigation procedures designed for military aircraft. "Maintain current altitude. I'm going to guide you using manual celestial navigation combined with ground reference landmarks," she told the pilots with absolute confidence. Outside their current flight path, unknown to the passengers, Air Force One was conducting a classified diplomatic mission with a full fighter escort. When Emily's call sign appeared on their frequencies, the entire escort squadron responded with simultaneous radio acknowledgement. "Raven 6, this is Falcon Squadron. Honor to have you back on the radio." The passengers in the cabin, listening through the open cockpit door, heard her call sign repeated multiple times by military aircraft they couldn't see, but whose respect was unmistakable. Emily guided the commercial aircraft through complex navigation procedures using skills she had hoped never to need again. She calculated wind drift, identified ground reference points through breaks in cloud cover, and coordinated with military air traffic controllers who immediately prioritized their emergency over all other air traffic. Within 30 minutes, the aircraft was back on course, with full navigation restored through emergency military communication networks. The businessman who had mocked her sat in stunned silence, finally understanding he was witnessing something far beyond his comprehension. The transformation was complete. The insignificant civilian in seat 22C had revealed herself to be someone whose skills commanded respect from the highest levels of military aviation. As Emily successfully guided the aircraft back to safe navigation, the full scope of her identity began to emerge through radio communications that the entire cabin could hear. "Raven 6, this is Eagle Control. Confirm your current status," came the voice from Air Traffic Control. "Civilian transport assist complete. Passengers secure," Emily responded with military precision. The captain and co-pilot listened in amazement as Emily coordinated with multiple military agencies, using call signs and procedures that indicated the highest levels of security clearance. An Air Force colonel's voice crackled through the radio. "Raven 6, your former squadron sends respect. You saved a lot of lives during your service years." Emily's response was characteristically modest. "Just doing what needed to be done, sir." But the radio chatter revealed the truth to everyone listening. Emily had been the commanding officer of an elite F-16 squadron specifically tasked with protecting Air Force One during high-risk diplomatic missions. Her tactical flying abilities had been legendary. Military aviation instructors still used recordings of her missions as training examples for advanced pilot candidates. The captain found his voice. "Ma'am, I don't understand. If you have this level of military aviation experience, why are you flying as a passenger in economy?" Emily's answer was quiet but honest. "I lost someone under my command. I decided the sky was better protected by someone else." But the radio communications continued, painting a picture of service that went far beyond what Emily was willing to claim for herself. "Raven 6, you should know your navigation assist today prevented a potential mid-air collision with classified air traffic," the air traffic controller informed her. The passengers realized they hadn't just been saved from being lost. They had been saved from a catastrophic accident that could have involved military aircraft on classified missions. An intelligence officer monitoring the frequency added, "Raven 6's squadron flew more successful protection missions than any unit in Air Force history. 0 casualties under her direct command until—" "That's enough," Emily interrupted. "The past is the past." But passengers had heard enough to understand they were in the presence of someone whose military service had protected the highest levels of American government. The businessman who had mocked her earlier approached the cockpit door. "Ma'am, I owe you more than an apology." "We all do." Emily simply nodded. "Everyone makes assumptions. Just try to make better ones." As they approached their destination airport, more details emerged through official channels. Captain Emily Rhodes had been the youngest squadron commander in Air Force history to be assigned Air Force One protection duties. Her innovation in defensive flying tactics had been classified and studied at the highest levels of military aviation. But her military career had ended abruptly when Lieutenant Sarah Chen, her wingman and closest friend, had been killed during a successful mission that saved everyone aboard Air Force One during a diplomatic crisis. Emily had blamed herself for Chen's death, despite military investigators concluding that no tactical decision could have prevented the loss given the unexpected nature of the threat. She had requested immediate discharge, turning down promotions and honors to disappear into civilian life. "She was one of our finest officers," the Air Force colonel's voice continued over the radio. "Her departure was a significant loss to military aviation." A passenger listening to these communications later wrote, "I realized I had been sitting next to someone whose service had protected our nation's leadership, someone whose skills had just saved our lives, and I had dismissed her because of her economy seat and casual clothes." The approach to landing was flawless, with Emily providing guidance that impressed even the experienced commercial pilots. As they touched down safely, applause erupted throughout the cabin, but Emily was already gathering her belongings and preparing to blend back into anonymity. The last radio transmission came from Air Force One itself. "Raven 6, this is Eagle. The bird you once protected sends gratitude for today's service. Your call sign will always be honored in our skies." Emily's response was brief. "Honor to serve, sir." Raven 6 out. She had saved not just the passengers on her flight, but potentially prevented a disaster involving classified military operations that civilians would never hear about. The woman they had humiliated in seat 22C had revealed herself to be one of the most skilled and decorated pilots in American military history. When the aircraft landed safely, passengers erupted in thunderous applause that continued for several minutes. Emily quietly returned to seat 22C and retrieved her carry-on bag like any ordinary passenger preparing to deplane. The businessman who had mocked her earlier approached with his face red from embarrassment. "I was completely wrong about you." Emily simply replied, "It's human nature to make assumptions. Just try to live with more awareness." Media crews waited at the gate, having been alerted about the emergency and the mysterious Raven 6 who had assisted. But Emily walked straight past them, her small figure disappearing into the crowd of travelers. She had no interest in interviews or recognition. Her goal remained the same as it had been for 7 years, maintaining anonymity while visiting her aging mother. But word of the incident spread quickly through military and aviation communities. Within hours, social media was filled with posts from veterans sharing stories about Raven 6's legendary service, though most details remained classified. The seat 22C, once a symbol of her humiliation, had become evidence that extraordinary people could be found in the most unexpected places. Flight attendants from the airline began treating all passengers with notably more respect, understanding that they might be serving individuals whose backgrounds and capabilities far exceeded their assumptions. The captain submitted a commendation report praising Emily's assistance, though she had requested that her full identity remain confidential. A week later, Emily received a package at her mother's address, a new flight manual from the Air Force, with a note reading, "For when the sky calls you home. Your squadron remembers." She also found letters from the passengers on her flight, thanking her not just for saving their lives, but for teaching them about the danger of judging people by superficial appearances. One passenger wrote, "I learned more about humility and hidden heroism in one flight than I had in years of business travel." Emily kept the letters, but returned the flight manual with a polite note declining the Air Force's subtle invitation to return to active duty. She had made peace with using her skills when genuinely needed, but her commitment to civilian life remained firm. However, she began volunteering at a local veterans support center, helping former military aviators transition to civilian careers. Her mother, learning about the incident from news reports, simply smiled. "I always knew you were still protecting people, Emily." Just in a different way. The humiliation of seat 22C had transformed into a reminder that heroes often traveled quietly among us. People once mocked Emily, thinking she was just an invisible economy passenger. But when life and death hung in the balance, call sign Raven 6 made the entire sky bow in respect. Emily didn't need applause or media attention. She only needed to keep the lives in that cabin safe. The lesson is profound. Don't dismiss anyone just because they sit in 22C or dress simply. They might be the silent hero who's the only reason you survive to go home. Hidden among ordinary passengers, workers, and civilians are people who have served at the highest levels, who possess skills that could save your life, and who choose anonymity not from failure, but from humility. The most dangerous assumption is that someone's current situation reflects their full capability or worth. If you believe that quiet heroes deserve to be remembered, leave a dot in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to SN Quiet Stories to hear more tales like this.